Nanos. Today's Thursday, March 9th, and we are having our continuing coverage of both the Aaron Hernandez and the War Machine criminal trials. This is the week that if you are beginning to watch live streaming of trials, this is the week to do it. Yesterday was an incredibly exciting day on both trials. And I would like to start out just reminding our viewers or showing them for the first time what you may have missed in the War Machine trial. Yesterday, victim or alleged victim Christy Mack took the stand and gave a couple hours of gripping testimony. We heard everything from these people's crazy relationship to what kind of rough sex they were interested in, to what happened on the night in question, to a 911 call. It was emotional, it was frightening, it was upsetting, and ultimately, Christy Mack was really, really an incredible witness. So I'm going to start out just by showing some viewers a little bit of what you may have missed yesterday. Here's a short clip of Christy Mack explaining a little bit about the background of her relationship with War Machine, the MMA fighter who is accused of attempted murder. Take a look.
I want to say 3 or 4 months in.
How did it start?
I don't remember our first fight that became physical. I don't remember exactly what it was over.
But when you say it became physical, can you explain to me what he would do, like physically violent-wise?
In the beginning, it would just be like a slap in the face, and that would be it, or just choking me, and that would be it.
So when you say choking, we've already talked about choking in the bedroom, like consensual choking during sex.
Yes.
Would you consider that to be different than the choking you and I are talking about right now?
Yes, it would be very different.
Can you explain to me how?
This was not at my request. When we were having consensual sex, I would request him to choke me. He wouldn't normally do it of his own accord, but if we were in an argument and he became violent, he would just begin choking me. There would be no sexual contact before or immediately after.
When he would choke you, how would he do it? Like, what mechanism would he use?
Usually he would just use one hand to choke me. I don't remember him ever using 2 hands, but sometimes he would put my neck in the crook of his arm and then put his other arm around it to hold me closer.
When he would do this, was your breathing impeded?
Yes, it was.
Would you see stars or lose consciousness?
Usually, yes.
Usually you would lose consciousness?
Yes.
You said that it started with just like a slap to the face?
Yes.
And when you say slap to the face, is that would it be an open hand?
It was almost always open hand.
When you say it was almost always, did he ever, bless you, Your Honor, did he ever use a fist?
Not until August 7th.
And that was just a little piece of Christy Mack's very gripping, very emotional testimony. I'm Elura Nanos, welcome back. And I'd like to welcome my guest for today, Deborah Blum. Welcome. She's a criminal defense attorney in New York. And Deborah, I'd like to really get some of your take on what's going on with this trial. Yesterday's testimony, even before we had the victim on the stand, we had an expert witness, therapist, I think she was a social worker. She was talking about domestic violence, sort of generally. She was talking about what is typical, what's not typical, really kind of painting the picture for the jury about what they can expect with regard to domestic violence victims. And that, I thought, really set the stage for what's to come next when we had the victim on the stand. So I'd like to hear from a seasoned criminal defense lawyer. How do you think this is going? I know, today we're going to see Christy Mack on the stand for a little more direct exam and for cross-exam. But up to this point, what do you think is going on in the mind of the defense?
Well, I'd first like to discuss what you brought up. Domestic violence. I represent a lot of people who are accused of domestic violence, and oftentimes it is not true, and they face very harsh repercussions. So a alleged victim can go into family court and get a order of protection just by going themselves without having their spouse or partner have the opportunity to defend themselves. And then also they can go to the police and make accusations against them where the person will be held arraigned and have to go through the criminal process, oftentimes to be vindicated. But at the end of the day, there are a lot of false domestic violence claims. In this matter, it does not seem to be the case.
And let me ask you this, because I in my own experience in the domestic violence legal world, what I know is that there's a lot of domestic violence that goes unreported, which is what the expert witness testified to yesterday, that often people live in domestic violent relationships for 40, 50 years and don't even report it. And at the same time, the nature of domestic violence as a crime does lend itself to false accusations, because often, these are crimes that are committed in the confines of private homes. It often comes down to, differing accounts of what happened. So it does have that danger of there being a lot of false accusations. So in your experience, have you personally seen cases of domestic violence that go all the way past the reporting stage, past maybe an order of protection stage, to the legal phase, where there end up being false convictions for domestic violence? Or what's your experience
Fortunately,
there?
my clients have gotten out of the charges due to my efforts, their efforts, and also the prosecution ultimately doing the right thing. But of course, you see instances of people having false convictions where they absolutely did not commit the crime. Of course, you're not there. But in certain situations, it's clear that someone is the victim of domestic violence, and oftentimes they won't report it and they'll keep it to themselves. In this situation, it's reported that Christy, her mother was living with her, and she would try to hide what was going on from her mother.
And I'd like to ask you, what do you make of that? Because yesterday, during Christy Mack's testimony, we heard several instances of her describing situations where her mother was in the house with her and the defendant, where she had either just been beat up, or had bruising, or there was violence going on in the home. And she would describe situations where her mother would stay in her own room for days on end and not see her daughter being victimized. What's your take on that? Is your take that that's ridiculous, or that really could happen? What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's a bizarre twist in this case, and something that the defense is going to use to their advantage. Because if the mother was there and knew that her daughter was being abused, why didn't she call the police? Why was there not a prompt outcry? Why didn't she go and see what was going on with her daughter? And it's even said that she saw some of the things that was going on. So to me, the defense should argue clearly that that shows it didn't happen, or maybe that this is a gross exaggeration, or maybe, as they're going to try to do, that the victim herself wanted these things to happen, and that this was her own fantasy world that played itself out.
But theoretically, her mother wouldn't necessarily have known if it was her fantasy, right? I mean, even if it was her fantasy, her mother wouldn't necessarily have been able to say, well, I'm not going to call the police because I know that this is my daughter's fantasy.
Well,
That's a little
mothers
odd.
seem to have a lot of intuition, but yeah, it does really, it's very odd, and I think something the defense could use to their advantage, although the prosecution is going to try to argue that the mother was also afraid of this MMA star.
That's what I was going to ask, because to me, that seems like for a prosecutor, seems like a good avenue to go down, to say, well, Christy Mack really painted the picture of being terrified of this guy. It wouldn't be so strange to imagine that her mother was also really afraid.
Well, he's a lethal weapon. A professional fighter, everyone knows, is a lethal weapon. And she did an amazing job in her testimony yesterday. I can't imagine having to sit there in front of all the jurors and go through her emotional account the way that she did.
And one of the things that really struck me, just in terms of kind of how her testimony played, because in a courtroom, as you know, the content of testimony is at least as important as the delivery of that testimony. I mean, this is a theater to a degree, and when we have a high impact witness like a victim witness, it is critical that that witness's testimony comes off credible, interesting, that it makes sense, that there are not holes in that testimony. And I felt that this witness, Christy Mack in particular, ran the risk because of who she is and what her professional background is, ran the risk of potentially alienating some of the jurors. She's an adult film star. She is covered with tattoos. She showed up on the stand with daggers on her fingernails, or what looked like, really pointy, kind of scary-looking fingernails. She is someone who, by her own testimony, had a kind of tough guy type persona within the adult film industry. These are all things that, taken together, really run the risk of making a juror say, I don't know. This woman is so different from me that I almost can't trust what she says. All that being the case, my personal takeaway was that she was an unbelievably credible witness, and that the prosecutor did an incredible job of getting her story to make sense every single step of the way. Do you agree with that?
Well, the prosecution definitely did a lot of leading, and I'm surprised that the defense attorneys didn't object more to the questions, which are supposed to be open-ended, but instead the prosecution basically walked her step through step by leading her. And
which is unusual.
It is really unusual.
And against the rules.
Yeah, I'm not sure why there weren't objections. I think that sometimes you don't want to interrupt the flow, especially if you know it's not going to hurt your client.
Right.
But some of the things were damaging that the prosecutor led her.
Yeah, I know that I even at one point took a break and looked up the Nevada rules of evidence to see if something was different than my own understanding, because prosecutors never ask leading questions to their own witnesses.
Well, I wouldn't say that they never do. They
they're not
do.
supposed. They're not supposed to.
Right.
And in my own experience, I've only really seen prosecutors properly ask leading questions when it's stuff that nobody really is going to dispute.
Well, in my experience, I can't always say that the prosecutor plays by the rules. Oftentimes, I find that they do things that are borderline unethical, although I've had wonderful relationships with prosecutors, so you can't generalize.
Right.
But I think that this trial is unique. As we were saying, she's a unique witness. I think the prosecution here did a good job in bringing out her past, explaining her fetishes, explaining that she was an adult film star, and she was pretty moving in her explanation. And she also explains that she was a victim of domestic violence and that she feared for her life.
Absolutely. I think I'd like to take a look at a clip right now. Let's go to our clip number 4. This is an important clip that just brings the jury and, of course, our viewers into the mind of Christy Mack and what she was thinking during her relationship with War Machine. This is a clip where she's talking about her kind of prolonged efforts to make this guy feel special, and that insight, I think, is really key to who she is as a victim here and what her role in this was. Do we have that ready to go? Okay, great. Take a look.
Not at all. That's actually how he found me, so I feel like he was totally fine with it. He had also worked in the adult industry, so I thought he would understand.
Okay. At some point, did his viewpoint towards your job change?
Yes, it did.
In what ways?
I wouldn't be able to have sex with him as frequently if I were working.
Okay.
And he did not like that at all. Towards the end, when I would come home from shoots, he would be disgusted by me, and he would tell me he was disgusted with me.
Okay.
He just generally didn't like sharing me with other people, which I totally understood.
Okay. Did you, when you got home, would he want you to shower?
Yes.
Even if you showered like on the shoot, would he still want you to shower once you got home?
Yes, he would.
And you may have explained this, but I want to ask you a few more details. Before or after you've done a shoot for an adult film, you cannot have sexual intercourse with like a partner, is that correct?
For me, I couldn't. For everyone, it's different, but for me personally, it was just uncomfortable.
Okay. Like physically uncomfortable?
Yes, physically uncomfortable.
Due to the fact that you couldn't be intimate in these types of situations, would you try to please him in other ways, or would you try to make concessions?
Yes, I would.
Can you explain how you would do so?
His sex drive was so high, and we just didn't match in that way.
I'm sorry, can you explain that when you say his sex drive was so high and you didn't match. Can you explain that, please?
I'm not exactly a hypersexual person. I know it doesn't completely make sense with my adult industry background, but I only wanted to have sex maybe once a day, if not every 2 days. But he would want it 2-3 times a day, and I couldn't keep up. So I had asked him if an open relationship is something that he would like to explore. He said yes, he would like to do that. So I offered to let him have other women. And then I would also try and give him ways to make him feel special, such as doing things that I wouldn't do in any other relationship, such as like trying anal in my personal life, which I had never done. Just things like that. I would try and give him positive affirmations all of the time, that he was the best, that he was the biggest, that he was everything that I could ever need and more.
Okay. So, because what you did for a living had become an issue between the two of you, are you saying that you had to develop, certain strategies to make him feel like he was special?
Yes, of course.
And since you were sharing yourself, professionally in so many different ways with other people, did it make him feel better if he was allowed to do things to you or with you that no one had ever done?
So that was a clip of Christy Mack, the alleged victim in the War Machine attempted murder trial, discussing kind of the background of their relationship. I'm Elura Nanos. Again, I'm here with Deborah Blum. Deborah, what do you think the defense strategy should be right now going forward?
Well, it's going to be what they're doing, that this was a consensual act, that she had extremely out there sexual proclivities, that she engaged in these rape fantasies, wanted this sexual type of acts. I know that the judge has limited the scope of what the defense will be able to get in and their attack on her, but they will try to bring out that this was a consensual act. They're going to try to say that she invited him over. I believe there was a text message from that evening asking him to come to her house, and they're just going to try to poke holes in all of her testimony. They're going to try to bring out the fact that her mother was there, that it's not believable that she would stay in her room for days, that it's not believable that her mother wouldn't have called the police, that she ultimately wouldn't have called the police. I believe that she made false rape accusation in the past. I wasn't able to find much information on that, but that she's somebody who is not trustworthy. They're going to try to bring up anything they possibly can to cast doubt.
And one of the things that you said is they're going to try to characterize Christy Mack as someone who has these kind of crazy sexual proclivities. And I think that, if you just take a snapshot, she's a star in the adult film industry. And that fact alone could make many jurors at least open to the idea that maybe this is somebody that has some kind of crazy life and desires. It's not completely out of the question. I could see that being something that carries a lot of weight with jurors. However, when she on the stand talked about how she would, when she worked, meaning, when she was making an adult film, she would come home and she was not interested in having sex with her boyfriend. I think that's something in the way that she told and described kind of that issue in their relationship. And, she would come home and he would want to have sex and she wasn't really interested in that. So she would kind of devise ways to like put him off or satisfy him or, ploy him with compliments or whatever it took. I wouldn't be surprised if that actually played quite well with many jurors who maybe now would begin to characterize her job in the adult film industry more like any other job. Because to me, that's how it sounded, like any other working woman that is like tired and comes home and doesn't want to be bothered. Did it play that way to you? Do you think that worked?
I think that the defense will be able to, or at least attempt to use it to their advantage. This is someone who used to do fetish work. So this is someone whose sexual openness is a lot greater than your average person. So I don't know that most of us can understand or be in her shoes or in her mind. And the defense is going to try to say, well, you wanted this type of sex life,
right,
and you participated, you invited it, it was consensual.
And I think, yeah, that has to be their strategy, but that strategy doesn't necessarily line up with the testimony that we're seeing, because we're not seeing someone who appears really kind of out of the ordinary. We're not hearing her say things that are really out of the ordinary. She's describing in many ways a very typical relationship where one person has significant control over the other. And I think following the expert testimony, who described exactly those kind of dynamics in many abusive relationships, it sort of just fits right in.
I would agree with you that this appears to be a domestic violence relationship where she just takes his abuse and basically cowers and does everything she can to appease him. And also, you know, she is an adult film star, and I'm sure that any man probably would have difficulty dating someone who's an adult film star, and that's a unique dynamic, but that does not excuse domestic violence.
Right, and I think that you're right, that I think you touched on something that I find really interesting, that when you think about how can a couple, when either person is engaged with sex with other people as their profession, how on earth would that relationship work? I think that many people kind of would naturally have that question, like, how is this going to work emotionally between these people? How is it going to be okay with one person that the other person is having sex with other people as their profession? It seems a little odd. And I think that whenever jurors are in a situation where they're being presented with a lifestyle that is drastically different from their own, they need a sort of guide into that lifestyle. And from the prosecution standpoint, Christy Mack is that guide. She is going to describe for the jurors what it was like to be in that relationship. And her descriptions were pretty grim, because she did talk about what she had to do to kind of make up for the fact that she was an adult film star.
Well, she definitely described him as choking her, holding her by the neck, carrying her up the stairs by the neck. These are very alarming and disturbing accusations. So what we have here is a woman who meets the criteria for a victim of domestic violence, and I'm sure that the prosecutor prepared her because she's testifying incredibly well. So part of this is when you, as you said before, when you have a witness, you prepare them, and it is in part like acting.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I noticed in my own experience in courtrooms when there are domestic violence victims present is that something that I've seen time and time again in the courtroom and out of the courtroom is that victims of domestic violence very often, not always, but very often come across with a flat affect. They're sort of detached, and often this works really against them in court. Often it's a way of shielding themselves emotionally from the very painful things that they're talking about, and the result of that very often is that people who are watching, whether it's a viewer, a jury, a judge, sometimes walk away from that thinking, is this person even being truthful? Because they often are not very emotional, and as a way of distancing. Have you seen that too? Do you know what I'm talking about?
People detach themselves from the experience because it's so painful for them. But
here we didn't see it though.
Right. Here she's animated, but she also is an actress.
She also is a professional actress, so who knows what that means.
Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, people make things up. So it's really a determination for the jury. Is she telling the truth?
Right. I mean, if she's lying, if she's making this up, this is quite a performance, because she was on the stand for a couple of hours, I think, yesterday. And in that time, we saw tears. We saw very appropriate emotional responses. We didn't see really what I would call histrionics at all. We didn't see her, being overly emotional. We saw her being appropriately emotional. We also saw her being extremely articulate. We saw her explaining things in a way that was easy to follow, that made sense within the context of the overall testimony. And I think those things taken together are really important. One of the things that I want to send another clip to here is her fear. Because when we have a domestic violence situation, the natural question always is, well, if you were not consenting to this, why didn't you call the police? And that's a critical thing to explain on the part of the prosecution. So here, her take on it is, I did not call the police because I was afraid. And she said a couple of things about being afraid. She talked about how obviously she was afraid of the defendant, but also that he had friends that were Hells Angels and Navy SEALs, and she was afraid that they were going to come and hurt her should she have gone to the police. I'd like to take a look at clip number 9. This is a clip where Christy Mack talks about a different incident, not the incident that that this prosecution relates to, but this is an incident where she discusses having custom-made gold fangs, and then during an argument with the defendant, taking out those fangs because she knew she was going to be hit. And I think that this is very telling of a person who is in a relationship when they are chronically afraid of that person. Let's take a look.
Were there times in your home where your mother did witness domestic violence happening towards you?
Yes, only a couple of times.
And that was committed by the defendant?
Yes.
I want to move on and ask you some questions. Did you ever have like gold-plated fangs?
Yes, I did.
Can you explain kind of what they look like and where you got them from?
They were just caps that go over my incisors, and they're pointy. They basically just look like gold fangs.
Where did you get them from?
A guy in California offered to make me things at a discounted rate, and that's something that I had put online that I wanted, so he contacted me and told me that he would do it.
Okay. And so did there come a night when you wore those fangs out in public with the defendant here in Las Vegas?
Yes.
Where did you guys go?
We went to a sushi dinner right down the street.
And right down the street from your home?
Yes.
And can you explain, was there any violence that night?
As we were going home, well, throughout the day, he was driving from San Diego that night. Throughout the day, he had given me a lot of hell about, me getting these fangs and me posting something for this guy that made the fangs for me.
Well, why did he care about the fangs?